Bonjour à toutes et à tous, bienvenue pour ce nouvel épisode de cette série sur la gestion des chats sur les petites îles. Nous sommes ravis de vous retrouver aujourd'hui. Nous sommes un peu partout sur la planète, entre la Nouvelle-Zélande, la Californie, le Mexique et la France. Ravis de vous retrouver pour avancer avec vous sur la gestion de ces chats sur les petites îles. Si vous étiez aux deux premiers épisodes, vous savez d'ores et déjà que vous pouvez poser vos questions dans la question box avec Q&A ou Q&A en bas de votre écran ou en haut de votre logiciel. Ces questions, vous les posez pendant que les speakers interviennent et ensuite, ce sera Enora qui va faire la synthèse de vos questions, trouver les questions qui se rattachent le plus au présentateur et ensuite qui leur retransmettra. Il y a une traduction, et c'est Isabella qui assure une fois de plus, merci à elle, la traduction que vous retrouvez en bas sur le petit globe terrestre. Vous cochez English, French, as you prefer. Et pour les speakers, sachez évidemment que vous êtes enregistré, que vous allez être rediffusé sur nos réseaux sociaux et sur la chaîne YouTube de la délégation internationale du Conservatoire du littoral. Donc attention à ce que vous dites. Vous allez être là pour l'éternité, peut-être même un peu plus. Pourquoi ICO Solutions s'intéresse aux chats? ICO Solutions, c'est une initiative qui a été lancée il y a quelques années, désormais, par des partenaires de différents pays en Méditerranée. Et l'idée, c'est que ICO, ça veut dire île, côte, océan et solutions. Et notre idée, c'est de travailler avec des experts, des scientifiques, des ONG, des chercheurs, des institutions, des bailleurs de fonds pour trouver ensemble et réfléchir ensemble à des solutions. C'est pour ça que le Conservatoire du littoral, l'initiative internationale pour les petites îles de Méditerranée et SMILO, Small Island Organization, travaillent ensemble aujourd'hui à l'organisation de cette série de webinaires destinés à la gestion des chats sur les îles. Alors pourquoi? Comme vous le savez, effectivement, les chats sur les îles peuvent être une vraie problématique pour la biodiversité. C'est essentiel aujourd'hui d'avoir une très bonne approche. Et donc là, vous avez eu déjà le plaisir lors des deux premiers épisodes et le troisième aujourd'hui encore mieux. Vous aurez des experts, des gens qui vont faire un retour d'expérience sur comment ils ont fait pour gérer des chats sur différentes îles de la planète et partager leurs réflexions et retours d'expérience et les leçons qu'ils ont retenues de ces différentes mises en œuvre. Donc aujourd'hui, nous sommes sur le troisième épisode, nous arrivons à l'instant ultime où il n'y a plus le choix, il faut éradiquer les chats qui sont sur le territoire. Nous avions vu au premier épisode comment éviter l'invasion des chats sur les îles. Nous avons aussi, grâce à Elisabeth, évoqué les différentes stratégies, la réflexion pour la stratégie à mettre en œuvre pour savoir si on allait contrôler, éradiquer les chats. Dans le deuxième épisode, que vous pouvez là aussi retrouver sur le site web ICO Solutions, vous trouvez ça, le lien à la fin du webinaire. Vous avez trouvé dans le deuxième épisode des techniques douces de contrôle des chats. Aujourd'hui, nous allons jusqu'à au dernier recours, donc l'éradication des chats. Je remercie toute l'équipe qui a été chargée de l'organisation ces dernières semaines. Donc, Enora, qui sera aujourd'hui à la question box, Angélique, qui est derrière dans le back-office et qui gère tous les enjeux techniques, Cyrielle, qui a porté l'organisation avec Enora de ces séries, et Isabella, qui assure aujourd'hui plus notre interprétariat. Le programme du jour, 2 cas d'études, qui vont être introduits d'abord par Elisabeth Bell, qui est toujours en Nouvelle-Zélande. Il est toujours très très tôt le matin à Blenheim et malgré tout, Elisabeth continue à faire son troisième épisode avec nous. Je la remercie 1000 fois. Bravo. Et nous allons avoir Luciana Luna et Antonio Ortiz qui vont nous présenter un retour d'expérience sur la gestion des îles de Guadeloupe et Socorro au Mexique. Et ensuite, Chad Hanson de Island Conservation qui va nous parler de l'île de Saint-Nicolas qui se trouve en Californie, si je ne me trompe. On conclura ensuite par Elisabeth qui reviendra et fera une synthèse de ce nouvel épisode. Je vous propose à chacun d'entre vous de vous présenter en une petite minute pour savoir qui vous êtes et quelles sont vos références pour nous parler aujourd'hui des chats. Je commence par Chad Hanson, qui est le Deputy Vice President de Island Conservation. Et donc, Chad, Where are you from, and where are you talking from, and who are you?
Sure. Yeah. So Chad Hansen, I'm the Deputy Vice President of our Conservation Department at Island Conservation. We're a nonprofit NGO who we work globally. And I'm based right now in Oregon on the west coast of the United States. It's not too bad for me. It's 7 a.m. in the morning. And yeah, I look forward to the presentation today, which is a unique one for us, actually based in the US, where usually we're working internationally.
Merci beaucoup, Chad. Not too early, but 7 it's early. Less than Elizabeth, but still early. Nous allons donner maintenant la parole à Luciana. Luna, je ne sais pas si Antonio a pu nous rejoindre tout à l'heure. Luciana, ¿qué tal? Et qui es-tu?
I'm Luciana Luna, and my colleague Antonio Ortiz. We work in a Mexican NGO called Conservación de Islas. We have two offices. One is in Ensenada, near the border with the United States, near San Diego, and the other one at the tip of the Baja California Peninsula, in La Paz, where is my colleague Antonio Ortiz. Both of us, we have been working for several years now as part of this organization with invasive mammals and several islands, all kind of. I have been working mostly in dried ecosystems, and my colleague more in subtropical and tropical islands. So that we're going to be talking about Socorro and Guadalupe Island projects today, but a little bit of the other ones as well. Thank you for inviting us.
Merci, c'est un plaisir, c'est un honneur pour nous de vous avoir aujourd'hui pour témoigner de vos expériences. Nous allons passer maintenant la parole à Elisabeth, se présenter à nouveau et ensuite faire l'introduction de ce dernier épisode conclusif sur la gestion des chasses sur les îles. Please.
Good morning, everyone. So yes, it is very early in New Zealand, but it is fantastic to be here again. So I'm the Managing Director of Wildlife Management International. We're a New Zealand-based consultancy who specialise in island restoration and species management. And I've directed a number of invasive species eradications, including 4 major cat eradications, one on a very large island of 9,000 hectares. But we also do a number of control operations on public conservation land within New Zealand for the Department of Conservation. And we not only do eradications, we do a lot of endangered species work, and the bird in the picture that I'm holding is a black petrel, or Procellaria parkinsoni, and it's part of an ongoing research project that we do in New Zealand. But today we're here to talk about cat eradications and that final step where we have to use hard methods. So next slide. So what is a hard method of cat control? Generally, it's a lethal option. So basically we have to work hard and eradicate cats, so remove them using a range of techniques, and often these techniques are used in combination, and it can depend on your island characteristics and the species there that you're trying to protect, is why we have to use these methods. And there's obviously a lot of regulatory requirements, and if the island is inhabited, community approval needed to be able to use these methods. So next slide, please. So I'm just going to run through what some of these hard options are. Now, strangely enough, live traps is included in hard options, of course. So, you know, this is a range of traps, anything from cage traps to leg hold traps, snares and soft net traps. But yet, generally, the animal is caught and euthanized. So there's a whole range of things to do to get those animals, but generally, in this situation, the animal is euthanized afterwards. But of course, in some locations, you want to use these types of traps so that you can release non-target species unharmed. And if you are working on an inhabited island, that pet cats can be released unharmed. Next slide, please. But of course, on some islands, you get approval to be able to use kill traps. So these traps can be put in place, and there's a range of different types of traps that have got different humane testing approvals and can be used where cats are your only target species, or if you have other non-target species, that the traps are placed in a way that you can avoid those non-target species. Again, you can use these in certain locations on islands, so you can use them in combination with other methods, with either live traps or some of the methods I'll talk about next. But using kill traps means you can use a slightly less intensive check regime as well. Next slide, please. Hunting is another method that is used a lot on islands to eradicate cats. And you can hunt with dogs, you can hunt with rifles and shotguns, you can use day shooting or night shooting options using thermal devices or spotlighting. If you are doing this on an inhabited island, it does require your pet cats to be identified, or that pet cats are contained at night so that they're not going to be targeted at night. But of course, there's a lot of legal requirements and health and safety implications for this type of operation. Next slide, please. And then there's things like toxin use, diseases, or contraception. For toxins, there's two ways. It's either direct poisoning or through secondary poisoning by using an anticoagulant rodenticide to target rats first, that your carnivores will then eat and succumb to the poison that way. You can have the direct poison where things like 1080 or PAP are included into products or bait types so that the cats will eat them that way. Some are made now, like Curiosity or History or Eradicate, as a commercial method. There's also what we call the Felixer, which is a trap, but it actually uses a targeted spray application of the toxin, and it can be used multiple times as cats walk past. And it uses artificial intelligence to direct that spray only onto cats. Other operations have introduced a disease first to help reduce the number of cats before they then use another combination of hard control. Contraception at the moment is currently research only, and they're undertaking a few field trials in a few areas. But of course, there are things that have to be worked out about how this one can be working on an island, and particularly safely on an inhabited island. And it's going to be great to hear from Chad and Fenia and Antonio about their operations and how they use these techniques. And it will go straight over to them.
Thank you very much, Liz, for your intervention. Merci beaucoup. Nous allons traverser le Pacifique pour passer de la Nouvelle-Zélande aux côtes pacifiques du Mexique, et nous allons avoir Luciana qui va faire une présentation de méthodes de gestion qu'ils ont utilisées sur différentes îles, Guadeloupe et d'autres. Enfin, Luciana va nous le rappeler. Luciana, floor is yours.
Thank you. So yes, following just what Biz was mentioning, we want to share some experiences that we have had removing feral cats from Mexican islands. I'm not going to get into detail in the eradications, but more like using, following the general principles that have been mentioned in episode 1, 2, and what just Biz was mentioning just right now. So why we decided to move from control to eradication. For both islands, it was not feasible to do a control for a long term. Both are remote places. The operations are very expensive. Also, well, in this case, it was the only way to protect seabirds and landbirds from extinction was to eradication. It is a high investment, however, less expensive compared to control in the long term. Next, please. So in our country, all the ecosystem types range from tens of hectares to thousands of hectares. What we can see here is a dry, arid island in the top, a small one, and down below is Socorro Island. Socorro is very rough. It's 1,300 hectares, and it's not inhabited. It's only a military base in there, a very important base, but it's only military presence. So the logic of working there is different. And the next one, please. Guadalupe, on the other hand, is more in the Mediterranean belt that we have in the country. It's a more dry ecosystem with very marked seasons. It's not subtropical. Socorro is subtropical. This one is more dry, and we can see that the differences, however, still shares with Socorro the cliffs, very hard to go around. Both are volcanic places. Guadalupe is not active anymore. Socorro is. So also we have all these landscapes, which also the type of habitat changes, and also therefore the food resources can influence cat movements. So in Guadalupe Island, for example, feral cats more following prey. During winter, we can find them in this type of very steep areas, cliffs, looking for nocturnal seabirds. But on the other hand, during summer and fall, they move to grasslands where house mice, which are the main prey, are abundant. So first, considering the island where you're working, how difficult is to treat it as a single unit? Is it small enough to treat it as a single unit, or is it big, as in this case of Socorro, for example? This is I was just switching to Spanish, I don't know why. To the team that you have in the field, how many people do you have? Do you have roads to move around? Do you need to set up remote camps? So all that is very important to plan it just beforehand. And for example, in Socorro, we consider to divide the island in different zones due to the size and changes in topography. Given that we only have a few roads in there that you can see in red and orange in the image, we cannot move by using vehicles all over the place. So we have to plan beforehand. For example, in this case, we had to bring a boat to be able just to move around the island and just to be accessing some of the places where we had traps, which you can see in this map and as black dots, using the beaches. So we have the same in Guadalupe. In Guadalupe, we have very few roads. They are in very bad condition, can take several hours to get to one point to the other when you only have like 20 kilometers. But still, if the roads are in bad condition, it will take forever. So you need to plan all that in advance. So for that, it's very useful to have remote camps just located, scattered around the island. And also for the species dynamics and cycles. So it's very important to gather this information from the beginning, either the native and non-native. The feral cat population dynamics relied on one species mainly, or one group of species as seabirds, or they follow the fluctuations in numbers of other non-native species. That is the case for Guadalupe, for example, where the only terrestrial mammals are house mice and cats. So mice are the main drivers for cat population changes and relative abundance. We need to answer this question to know what will happen to mouse population if we get rid of cats. As cats are not keeping in check mouse numbers, it is unlikely that will have an effect once that they're gone from the place. We have tested that in the last years with the drought, we had as you know, 3 niñas in a row, so it has been very, very dry in the region. Few cats, but even less mice as grasses have been absent. It's not always the case, as Elsa was mentioning in the last episode about the predator release effect. So it depends on the species that you have on the island, but in this case for the house mice, it shouldn't be a problem to be able to remove the cat populations, because they're not. It's not a top-down system, it's a bottom-up one. So also for the next, that one, for the home range studies. So can we get what can we get with the information of how cats are using the habitat? Are they using the roads? Are they using cliffs? Are they around human settlements? In this picture, we have a GPS device, but that's not the only way to get this information from the system. You can also use the predation sign. You can set up sense stations and to see if the cat tracks in there. You can use camera traps, either with attractants or not, just to gather this information on how your cat population are moving on the island. So in this case for Guadalupe, it was very notorious that they're using the road a lot. They were moving in just a few hours. They were just walking kilometers and kilometers. They were getting into the cliffs. They were around the human settlements, the fishermen. There's a fisherman village there, and also the Navy base. So it just it's very useful information for planning for setting up the trapping devices that they use. And next, please. Also, depending on the chosen eradication method, we have to make sure of minimizing impacts to native species. So in the case of Guadalupe and Socorro, we rely mostly on trapping. We are using hunting as well, and detection dogs. And we rely a lot on camera traps. So, and for example, you have native animals that have a similar size to the target species, so in this case, the feral cats. You have to find a way to minimize those impacts. For example, in Espiritu Santo, we have the ring-tailed cat, the babisuri, which is around the same size as feral cats. For poisoning, for example, as you know, is one of the most effective methods to remove cats from islands. Usually you deliver it using baits. It's not the only way, but it's the most frequent way to deliver the toxin to the field. So how palatable will be the chosen bait for the target species? How attractive is going to be for the native ones? And in Mexican islands, we cannot use 1080 or PAP. And 1080 is banned in the country, and PAP is not yet registered to use in Mexico. But still wanted to test the baits, just thinking maybe another toxin in the future. So it was very interesting to see that several native, either endemic birds, were interested in them. And having this information, we can plan for mitigation measures in advance. Next, please. So also many native species won't be affected by our chosen methods. However, they can interfere with them. This is the case for Socorro Island. So in the setup, in this trapping, we have leg hole in what's called cuvee setting. So it's a leg hole at the bottom, and then you create like kind of a cave with branches. That one was completely modified by minutes just after the trap was set. So the trappers had to think in a different way to set up this trap to avoid interference of, in this case, the land crabs. Or if you can't, I mean, in this case, for example, Socorro and Guadalupe, there are projects that go in the long term, so several years. So you have, of course, you can you work in a season where the land crab population is not as high in numbers, but you also have to work in the humid, in the wet season when they are most active. But if you can plan to work in those seasons when the species that can interfere, where your devices are not as abundant, is much better. Next one, please. So also monitoring the recovery of native species, as we have been hearing, is a must, not only during and after the eradication program, but also it can give you very valuable information as a baseline. On Guadalupe Island, before moving to eradication, we did control of feral cats for many years around the Lice and Albatross colony. That allow us to know how dramatic the change will be after the cats were removed. I mean, in this graph, we can see the red line was the current scenario with cat predation, and then in blue, it was under the control scenario, and then modeling how the population will take off if we remove the cats, but also allow us to see how the techniques will going to work. So the first step was to build an exclosure fencing, and conduct a small scale eradication to test the method. So we learn a lot of that just to moving afterwards to the eradication. Next one, please. And just also for the camera traps, they help us to take management decisions, just to know how cats use the terrain, where are the times where they're more active, which is very valuable information for hunting, the varying individuals that we have. So sometimes we see them in the trap, that they get to the local trap and they're around and they sniff it, but they don't get into it. So there are some individuals that are by nature very wary, and also to confirm absence. We are working right now in using automatic recognition for the species, not yet the individuals, but we're still working on that. Next one, please. And then canine units. The dogs are typically used for the final stages of the eradication to find survivors or to confirm absence. However, we have been using them also to help us to identify productive areas, to set up or to move traps. For example, after a cat has been identified on camera traps, we take the dog and just, if we had the sighting several days ago, and then the dog is very useful to know where actually it's the most recent place where it was, and we can set up the trap in there. Next one, please. So on Guadalupe Island, we have a fisherman settlement. We had to work closely with them during the eradication campaign. They do own cats as pets, but mostly to control house mice. So we have to listen to their needs and to help them what we can. So right now they are able to keep their cats as long as they're sterilized and microchipped. And not only in Guadalupe, but also in the other islands, we work very closely with federal government, the Navy and the Natural Protected Areas Commission, just to strengthen biosecurity to the place and avoid the risk of invasion. I mean, preparing once the island is cat-free. Next one, please. And just to finalize, while collecting information of the system and target and also non-target species from day one is very important. And also engaging all the actors, local government, donors from the beginning as well. And just to get all the needs or worries of all the actors in the plan beforehand. And also all this operation, especially when it's eradication for several years, it requires a full commitment to personal, like highly motivation, very high. So we need to, and also for the personnel, it's a very high investment in capacity building. So you need to have, as Biz was saying just before, is going to be, especially at the end, you're going to be walking and checking on the traps 1 day, 2 days, 3 days, and you're going to be finding nothing, which is at the end what we want, but still you need to, the personnel needs to be aware of that. And also for hunting, you're going to be going out for several nights and then at the end getting nothing. So this is very important to have it in mind. Ideally, we should have a network of experts to review your eradication plan from the beginning, and also having in mind that these projects are adaptive management. So they're going to be changing. You need to be open to change. And with that, I'll finish, and I'll be happy to take any questions with my colleague Antonio, which is also available here to answer any questions. Thank you very much.
Merci beaucoup, Luciana, pour cette présentation très claire. On va retrouver Enora qui a reçu plusieurs questions dans la boîte à questions. Mais d'abord, d'autres questions qui sont arrivées avant. À partir de quand les chats sont arrivés sur l'île? Est-ce que ça fait très très longtemps? Est-ce qu'ils sont arrivés par la présence de l'homme? Est-ce que c'était avant l'installation du village de pêcheurs?
Yes, for Guadalupe Island, they have been there for about 100 years. It is believed that as many other places, the first animals, invasive mammals, terrestrial mammals to be introduced were house mice. And then it was a thought that the cats were brought afterwards just to be able to control the house mice population. It wasn't like the population that is right now. I mean, the fishermen population has been there village has been there for around 50 years. But this happened when there were ships visiting the island, hunting for the four seals, the Guadalupe four seals and the northern elephant seals. So they were visiting very often and going offshore very often. So they brought the mice and then the cats. So that was the way that they got to Guadalupe. And for Socorro, it's very, very similar. They have been there for a long time.
Dans votre présentation, vous avez dit aussi qu'il n'y avait pas de lien direct entre la présence des chats et le nombre de souris. Mais est-ce que justement aujourd'hui, dans le cadre de votre programme d'éradication et de contrôle des chats, est-ce que vous voyez que la population des souris reste stable aussi, ou est-ce qu'il y a quand même des fluctuations qui sont liées aux évolutions de présence des chats?
Yes, on Guadalupe, well, also on Socorro is the same. We only have house mice, fortunately. So it will be, and I know that in other islands it's very different when you have rats, because rats also they're like predators as well. So it's just there's when you remove the top predator, that will be the cat, then the mesopredator can explode. But in this case, for house mice, at least in Guadalupe, the system, this could be changed and this could be very particular and different in all places. But for Guadalupe Island, the house mice rely mostly on the food. So the seeds that come from introduced grasses. So the house mice will follow the fluctuations in the food resources. So cats, they do consume a lot of mice and they can eat a lot of mice. We know that, but they're not the amount of mice that they consume is not enough to keep the population in check. So even if we have a lot of cats, if we have good rains, there's no check for mice. On the contrary, if we have I mean, we have right now a few cats, so you shouldn't be able to have enough to control mice population, but we don't have mice because we didn't have rain last year. So in this case, for Guadalupe scenario, the mice rely on the food resources, and if we could remove all the seeds from Guadalupe, there will be no food for mice, so it wouldn't be a problem. Yeah, so cats are just following; they're not keeping check on that.
Thank you. So if I understood well, if you want to control mice, you have to control rain. It's sometimes complicated. But last question, and after it will be in our terms. You talk about biosecurity measures. What kind of measures are done by the Navy SEALs and people for this biosecurity?
Yeah, well, the first step is just to do environmental education and outreach, and just to let them know about the problem of having cats on islands and all that. So they, in turn, the Navy, just because both they have Navy settlements. The main way to get there is in the Navy ship. So if they're aware of that. So there's a check in there. And on the other hand, for the fishing village, is just to be working with them about the only way, I mean, they're allowed to have their cats there if they're sterilized. They cannot take them out. So because if they take them out, it's very difficult for them to get them in. So that's where the biosecurity thing, and there's only, you can get to the island only in the Navy ship, or there's also particular planes, but it's also military airport. So it's about just moving the information around. And for other species, we do have more active biosecurity things as for rodents and for insects. But for cats, it's mostly about, I mean, it's in other places, there we have had accidental introduction of kittens. So it's very good just to have the measures around and just be aware. For Guadalupe and Socorro, it's more difficult because it's more control. But it's just to have the information around, and also just to be checking on the military points if no cats go in and out.
Gracias. Merci beaucoup. Enora, à toi la parole pour quelques questions complémentaires.
Yes, hello everyone. So another question, do you find that the efficacy of different laws change when getting down to the last few cats? For example, do prey numbers increase and mate choices decrease, so sexual laws are more effective than bait laws?
Sorry, Nora, can you repeat it, please?
Yes, sorry. Do you find that the efficacy of different laws change when getting down to the last few cats? I can say.
The behavior or the...
In fact, I don't know the lures. I don't
know.
The
lures.
Lures, oh, sorry.
Lures, sorry. Yeah, lures. Yes, yeah, we have been changing those. Yeah, we start mainly with, we have used a whole range of baits. We have had the commercial ones, the pheromones and the ring and all that. We have been using mostly the food, I mean, canned, sardine, fried with tuna, or if we get some remains from the fisherman village. So mainly fish with oil, that's the basic. But yeah, when we get wary individuals, yeah, we remove that. We try to leave the place for a while. And what we normally use is that we change to the, I don't know what's the name in English, I don't remember, but it's when you set up a trap without an attractant, and you just use like a trail that they're using, and you set up the trap in there. It's a, yeah, I just forgot the name of that. So you don't use a lure. Especially when you see that the individual is very wary and is not about attracted by a food resource or even repelled by that, you use other as that one, or you can in that case change to a ring, or you can get it from the cats that you capture on the island and then mix it with glycerin and then add it, or use a commercial one. There's some for cats or other similar species that you can use. But yeah, it's very useful to change, either to use nothing and just to set up the trap setting just in a way that, and just it will step on your trap without using any attractant, or just to change to a different one. Yeah, that's a very good question. Yeah, it's
perfect. Thank you. Another question: how the communities and general public respond to this method, as some people don't understand the impact cats has on wildlife, and how do you educate the population?
Yes, yeah, it has been challenging. However, they normally have, being fishermen, they have an attachment to the place, and they want to see the place thriving. So sometimes it's just a matter that they even though they have been living there for decades, I mean, there are families, so you have men and women and a lot of children. They, many of them, they never saw lice and albatross, for example. So we took them to the colony and they see the chicks and they understand like why if one parent disappears then the chick will die. So these things of having them in the colony and seeing them. And also we talk with them because in both islands we have had extinctions of landbirds. So just showing them pictures of how that was there, but also making part of trying to. It takes a lot of time. Actually, we have one person that is dedicated only to be with them. She spent once in a while during the year. She spends 1 month with them. So just working with children and answering questions. And but they do. I mean, it takes some time, but some are very, very sensitive about that. Some of them have said, "Okay, I don't want to have a cat anymore. If you can give me some traps for house mice, I will be fine with that." But each family is different. Sometimes also the children are very attached to their animals. So in those cases, they're allowed to keep them and being sterilized, and also has changed the perception in terms of they know that their cats are more precious now because they're sterilized and they have a permit to have that cat with microchip. And if they lose that cat, it's not going to be easy to get another one because before they used to be okay, my cat dies and I will get another one, or I leave the island and I just leave the cat alone and will go to the become feral and I will get another one when I return, but that is not the case now. So it has been great working with children and yeah, it's making also the difference. But they're more conscious now because they know more about seabirds.
Okay, thank you so much. Just one last question. I'm sorry for the other. We don't have a lot of time. If 1080 banned and PAPP not available, what toxin are used or preferred for cats based in Mexico?
Well, there are other ones available. We were thinking and using secondary. Well, secondary poisoning will be the easiest right now with the regulations as they are, because Rodifacum is we have used that one for rodent eradication is allowed in the country. Our hopes are that for next eradications, a PAP could be registered in the country and we can use that one because we have been following how that one is used and it seems to be very, very effective. So I think that we'll go for that one. I mean, there are other availables, but they're not as effective. And I mean, we know that 1080 and PAP are the best ones. So we'll go for that one in the near future, hopefully.
Thank you so much, Luciana.
Merci beaucoup, Luciana. Avant de passer la parole à Chad, je voudrais quand même vous poser une dernière question qui nous a été envoyée par Ayman depuis la Tunisie. Sur une des cartes que vous avez présentées, il y avait les emplacements des pièges et on voyait effectivement que les emplacements des pièges n'étaient pas répartis sur toute l'île. Est-ce que c'était un problème d'inaccessibilité ou est-ce que c'était par rapport au trajet des chats que vous aviez suivi par GPS en amont? Et comment vous êtes sûr d'avoir attiré tous les chats dans les zones où il y a des pièges? Voilà, la dernière question et après dans la chat.
Yes, well, we mostly rely on legal traps, but we do use little traps as well. So for those places where it's very, very hard to access, or or places where we can go, but actually we cannot return very often, which are the beaches or some of the cliffs areas, we use little traps in there. And another, well, in both islands, we have had the opportunity to have helicopter there for other reasons. Well, for Socorro, it was especially for cat eradication. For Guadalupe, it was a combination between vegetation and cat eradication. So during that campaign, we used it to set up the remote camps and to place traps in remote places. But if not, I mean, the normal way to go is to use lethal traps and those places where most difficult ones to go. I mean, there's some places where you're never going to be able to cover, as the cliffs are very steep, and you know the cats are moving around because they're looking for birds. So what you do in those cases is that you set up the traps the closest that you can, and you with very attractive baits, and just the cats move a lot, and if they at some point either in the cliff eating seabirds, the breeding season is going to end, and they're going to have to move to look for other prey. So they move a lot, so we rely on that to get into our traps. And also well, that's basically it. So lethal traps and more accessible. Oh yes, and the other thing I was going to mention is that the useful thing of having several zones is that you can also decide, depending how many people do you have in the field, just to open some and others leave closed, and just moving around that.
Yeah, thank you very much. Merci beaucoup, Luciana. Nous allons maintenant passer la parole à Chad Hanson de Island Conservation, qui va nous présenter un exemple sur la côte pacifique des États-Unis, en Californie. Chad, thank you very much. It's early in California too. Please, it's now your turn to speak on.
Excellent, thank you. And fantastic work happening in Mexico. It's been great seeing those projects advance. They've done a lot of cat eradications there. So thank you. And in 10 minutes or less, hopefully we'll be able to try and maintain as much time as possible for questions. So you already have a sense on where I'm going to be talking about San Nicolas Island off the Southern California. And so, as I mentioned earlier, with island conservation, and our mission is to prevent extinctions on islands, and we do that by removing invasive species, and in this case, cats. So next slide, please. So as a satellite overview of San Nicolas Island, it's a Navy-owned weapons and training facility, weapons testing and training facility. It has restricted access, so the public cannot go and visit. The only people there are authorized military contractors and military personnel. So in the sense of an eradication standpoint, it's basically was treated as uninhabited. And so what you can see here, it's roughly 14.5 by 5.5 kilometers. So just about 5,900 hectares. It's rugged terrain. You see a lot of ravines here coming from a upper plateau, and there were a lot of considerations that Luciana was describing in the work on Guadalupe and Socorro that needed to be taken into consideration here with access and breaking the island up because of its size. Next slide, please. And so the goal was to protect threatened species. Our funding was related to a DDT settlement that happened in the region. And so the goal was to mitigate for impacts that occurred to seabirds and shorebirds. Our target was feral cats to help with habitat restoration. And really when it came down to it, it was also impacting 3 other threatened species on island and an endemic deer mouse that was there. And so when we were looking at what do we do eradication or control, we had to confront that. And that's a commonly discussed question. How do you go about doing that? And in our case, funding was really only present and available to support a one-time quantifiable expense, and the partnership had committed to limiting impacts to animal welfare. And so with control being over an indefinite period of time, so basically lethal removal of cats would have gone on forever, neither the cost of that or the animals impacted could be quantified. And so we selected eradication as the preferred approach, assuming that that was deemed feasible. And eradication started in 2009, and we are able to confirm in 2011. And I'll get a little bit into the details now. Next slide, please. So we are faced with a series of challenges. The first one was stakeholder interest. And so in the US, we have a compliance process, and part of that process is sharing information with the public, your project planning, and then you receive public comment that you can and should respond to. And in this case, we had about 5,800 public comments come in, and quite a few of those were in relation to the removal methods. So they were really suggesting and encouraging the project to consider live removal. And then there was the feasibility. And when you evaluate feasibility, you need to do so, at least from our perspective, with an eradication ethic. And so considering strategies and tools that are required not to remove the first, not to remove the majority of the animals, but really about thinking how to remove that last animal to achieve eradication success, because those are the ones that are disproportionately challenging and also the most expensive to remove. As well, toxins in this case were not permitted. You can see an endemic island fox here. This is one of the threatened species. Really shares a similar ecological niche, and is one of those species that was going to continue to compete for any tools or be at risk with tools for removal. And so as well, toxicants were out, and using common tools like trapping and hunting remained in question by partnership and other stakeholders, because the fox was going to be at risk of traps, potentially at risk for shooting, and so we had to take that into account when looking at feasibility. And last, the cost and logistics. San Nicolas Island is quite remote. It also required access. There was a great question earlier, and we had to identify specialized off-road equipment to provide access that was quick enough to get around, and a mobile vet clinic to come on. So any animal we ended up using trapping that was trapped could be assessed if there was any consideration of a potential fracture or hypothermia, things along those lines, so we could manage and mitigate for those challenges. Next slide. So some of the solutions. First, we needed to confirm feasibility. And by doing so, we needed to look at, could this be done? And so we reviewed the project against what had already been achieved at the time. There had been 83 successful cat eradications. So we knew that it was possible as a conservation tool. And we also knew, but that would be required with the right expertise and a really quality team that could tackle some of the challenges that I described earlier. And we also looked at against eradication criteria. So there's a great paper by Parks and Panetta. It came out in 2009 that breaks these down. And so we looked at that against what our ability for eradication was. So could we put every single cat on that island at risk? Was the rate of removal faster than the rate of reproduction? So could we beat that rate of increase? Also, can we manage immigration? So in the case of an island, is the biosecurity sufficient to keep any new cats from coming in? And could we limit any net adverse effects? So basically, is the benefit of the intervention, does that outweigh the costs of our presence there doing this work? And we also had trials. We had to look, were cage traps effective? Could we be effective with padded leg hold traps and mitigate impacts on that native fox, which is quite fragile? Were the remote cameras that were available at the time sufficient because they were kind of being developed along the way? And could we train foxes over time to stay out of our traps, because they were density-wise much more dense than what we anticipated cats were? And could we validate something like a trap monitoring system? Like you can see this photo here on the side of the slide, where we could remotely understand what our traps are doing, which was a major critical piece for the safeguarding foxes, as well as staying within the regulatory needs in the state of California. And so we also had to develop technology and strategies, services and protocols to guarantee or at least offer a high likelihood of success. And as I mentioned, this was for a number of reasons. We had to mitigate for the native species impacts. We also had to reduce costs. This was quite a large island at the time. It was the 5th largest and the 1st largest without toxicants being proposed. And we had to comply with those regulations. And lastly, the stakeholder compliance, it really was a serious piece to consider. And so what we did is we leaned into that conflict. We coordinated and collaborated with those stakeholders to understand really what was their opinion and how could we develop solutions together that would be broadly accepted. And in this case, what it meant is our original plan for lethal removal switched to live removal, and we partnered with the Humane Society of the US to support that component of the project. Once we were able to capture cats live, they could handle the subsequent removal and long-term housing, because the regulatory environment does not allow us to release an invasive species back into a new environment. Next slide, please. So here's a few pictures. On the left-hand side, at least on my screen, you can see we used detection dogs that were highly trained and would help, much like Luciana was describing, in detection and confirmation of absence. On the right-hand screen, there's some of our partners that helped run that mobile vet clinic. We had a few instances where we would have a suspected fracture, an actual fracture on the foxes. You can see them holding there with medical attention. And in the center is a trap set that we developed. They were all identical. They did not use bait. We used lures. So cat feces a little bit early on of catnip oil. And the intention there is we needed to show foxes that if you fell into that trap, it was not a pleasant experience. And we had to train every fox on island to stay out of those traps so they could remain available for cats to be removed. And so these, without the use of bait, you had to be able to identify where cats were going to walk. And that was often different than where foxes would walk. So a little behavioral analysis along the way. And the traps themselves were quite small and they were modified. So they would have the lowest impact for foxes, but still remain effective for cats. Next slide, please. So the project took 2 years. I think the key point here is you can see how we advanced through it, but really the period of removal was about 6 months. So it wasn't that long. There was a short period of trapping. You'll see spotlight hunting happened a bit later on. We didn't want to introduce traps again when we were down to just the last 2 animals, actually, because foxes were pupping, and if you pulled a lactating female from her pups, it really impacted their recruitment into the population. So we had to think about and adaptively manage for that. You can see also sign search happened well before we began removals. That's because we introduced a confirmation of detection model. And we also needed to identify where were the highest productivity sites to help select where we would incorporate the traps that we used. And then we continued to model and confirm the project until the final portion of the December there at the end of 2 years. Next slide, please. So we ended up removing a total of 66 cats over that period of time. We trapped over 1,000 foxes, about 450 individuals, and we pit tagged those. And so the whole population would be monitored and we could understand what was happening to them while we were doing the work with cats. 2 cats showed trap avoidance. Something happened along the way for some reason that they didn't want anything to do with that. And we knew they were still there because of our camera trap network. So we ended up having to utilize a subsequent method, which was spotlight hunting, to remove those. And through our confirmation of detection modeling, we got to close to 100% confidence that we were done. And that was after 270 kilometers of science search, over 3,000 camera nights. And we took that model and we actually pushed it to close to 30,000 trap nights because it was relatively novel and we wanted to test the modeling and the information that we were putting into it. And so we also had the project cost out at about $2.9 million. That did not include the live removal of cats, which was taken on by our partners at HSUS. It also didn't include in-kind costs from the Navy. And about 42% of that, so the biggest bulk of that expense was personnel over the implementation and the confirmation phase, where the live removal of cats was between, I think, $750,000 to $1 million, which was quite an expense. And another result, which was really interesting, is that remote trap monitoring network allowed us to reduce our trap response time down to 45 minutes on average to really limit the impacts to that native fox that I was describing. Whereas we had upwards per regulation of 24 hours to respond to those traps. Next slide, please. So in conclusion, we developed some new tools and technology that are now we're starting to see utilized elsewhere on cat removal programs. And the other pieces like the camera traps, we learned really interesting, what were ideal. So no glow versus low glow. We learned that cats would actually avoid the low glow after they had that interaction. So some pretty neat takeaways and lessons learned. We also learned that you can avoid conflict through leaning in, through novel partnerships, through conflict transformation with individuals who typically may seem challenging when you're looking at a project like this. And in communication alignment, we developed frequently asked questions, which not only was an amazing communications resource for stakeholders in the public, it also helped with aligning the partners in the project to understand really what we're trying to achieve together and what are each and every individual's goals and objectives along the way. And we also, through non-target mitigation and through tools like the trap monitoring system, allowed us to effectively manage non-target mitigation in a way that was meaningful and accepted. And lastly, with budget considerations, an interesting takeaway, this project penciled out to about $500 per hectare versus foray off of Australia. It's about the same size. That was conducted with use of toxicant at $4 per hectare. So if you look at that comparison, you need to also really consider, okay, if we're incorporating various strategies and tools and methodologies, you also need to be thinking about how that's going to impact the budget and how to plan that in, because one of the #1 reasons that you'll see eradication failure is because the funding runs out and there isn't enough to pull in that eradication ethic, which is about removing that last and final animal. Next slide, please. Excellent. Thank you.
It was the last. Merci beaucoup, Chad. Beaucoup de questions à nouveau concernant cette expérience. Une première question concernant les études préliminaires qui auraient été conduites avant. Est-ce que vous aviez précisément le nombre de chats sur l'île? Est-ce que vous aviez réussi à le déterminer à peu près? Et quels sont les autres comportements biologiques que vous aviez étudiés en amont? Les oiseaux, les reptiles, les insectes. Et au final, est-ce que dans le coût général des 3 millions de dollars, il y avait aussi le financement de ces études?
Great question. Yeah, so on the biological considerations for the work that we're doing and the way we look at it is it doesn't really matter how many cats are there. It's about understanding whether or not you have the right tools to remove whatever is present. So we didn't feel the need to invest in population analysis. We didn't feel the need to identify density. We did want to understand, though, more or less how many traps could we manage at a given time to really help mitigate for potential impacts on the native fox. Because we knew at their density, we were going to have them fall into our traps quite readily, minimizing the trap availability for cats. So what we did is we did a small trial study in advance with a few number of traps to see the frequency that foxes were going to spring those traps and be captured. So then we could help predict the number of traps that our field team could manage at a given time and how quickly we could train those foxes to avoid those trap sets. And so we showed that fox captures would actually decline quite rapidly because they did not want to fall back into a trap. Meanwhile, cat captures were consistent. And so because you weren't releasing those individuals, you were removing them from the environment. And the result was actually a rolling front of traps that we would just add a few more traps over time, because also those trap sets are quite labor intensive to set well and to set right. And it's more important to set the trap well and right than it is to poorly conduct a trap where you might have an educated animal that pulls out or experiences something negative and you no longer have that tool available to help remove that individual animal. I'm sorry, was there another component of that question?
Yeah, c'était pour savoir si vous aviez analysé avant l'éradication des chats d'autres compartiments biologiques comme l'ornithologie, l'herpétologie, l'entomologie, et savoir quel a été l'impact de cette éradication des chats sur les différents compartiments biologiques.
Yeah, that was something that our partners, so the Institute of Wildlife Studies, had been conducting. In fact, they had a lot of baseline monitoring that was ongoing prior, that was related to that endemic island fox, as well as the endemic deer mouse that's on island. So they had conducted those studies in advance and have continued to monitor the island post eradication.
Merci beaucoup. Une question, enfin plein d'autres questions. Quel a été l'impact sur les renards de ces piégeages? On a vu qu'il y a eu un peu plus de 1000 piégeages de renards. Est-ce que ça a généré du stress chez ces individus? Est-ce qu'ils ont eu un comportement de protection, de plus se cacher ensuite pour ces renards?
Yeah, that's an interesting question. And these foxes are really unique. They're quite tame. When you would trap them, you would pull them from the trap and you could lay them on their backs in your lap and do a full work through and process. You're feeling for any fractures in their bones and the metacarpals, also looking at temperature, and we would be putting in a pit tag, so a small transponder where you could individually identify them. And they were calm, collected, in the past, often bait was used with box traps. And so they were quite accustomed to being exposed to novel tools in the environment. And that was also an issue for us. We had to run a trial between box traps and leg holds because on this island in particular, leg holds proved to be 15 times more effective for use, primarily because foxes would just continue to go in box traps because they know the bait would offer a free feed, and they weren't as competitive with cats because cats were a much more efficient predator, and so they were reserved to eating beetles and some other secondary prey items because of the cat presence. But after trapping, any of them that had happened to have an injury would go back, or even a suspected injury would go back to that mobile vet clinic, and they would continue to monitor their vitals. And only a few individuals who were generally fairly older showed any sort of stress by being in those traps. That's also why that trap monitoring network was really critical, because it reduced our response time to such a small window that prolonged exposure, because hypothermia, hyperthermia, as well as them struggling to fight their way out of a trap or even gnawing at the jaws, all could have impacts to the health of those animals and the stress. So because of that, we were able to mitigate those impacts. Whereas if we didn't have a trap monitoring network, it wouldn't have been feasible, because of the impacts to foxes would have been too great, and we would have not met one of those eradication criteria.
Merci beaucoup. Une autre question concernant les tracking dogs. Pourquoi est-ce que vous avez utilisé des tracking dogs au milieu de la période de trapping? Est-ce que c'était pour contrôler le nombre de chats? Enfin voilà. Quel était l'objectif d'utiliser ces chiens de recherche? Et c'était pour chercher des chats, je suppose.
Great. Yeah, the objective to use the detection dogs and midway through was to help identify sites as that population was reduced quite dramatically, because you're not finding sign as frequently. And also remember that fox and a cat have very similar tracks. We had a highly experienced team to identify the nuance between a canid and a feline track. But in order to try and increase the likelihood of success with those traps being in a home range of a potential cat, the dogs were helping direct that, and helping direct our efforts of where we could either increase density or increase where we were deploying our camera network.
Merci beaucoup. Et Nora, d'autres questions de la boîte à questions?
Yes, we have another question. Can you explain what do you mean by cats avoiding low glow cameras? Does this relate to infrared versus white flash on cameras, and which was more avoided by cats?
Yeah, no, amazing. And we did a trial also on camera model types to see which one was proving to be more effective for our needs as well. So the low glow is the infrared, and if you've ever seen one of those those cameras functioning at night, there's three modes. You have a white flash, a low glow, which is the infrared LED, and then a no glow, which is almost imperceptible for the human eye. And I'm just talking about the low glow and the no glow, so no white flash. And even the low glow, it proved we would have images of cats coming by, immediately looking at the camera as it would go off, and we would have specific markings on that cat, and it would not pass by that camera again. So it showed us that they were being very aware and cognizant. And so we transitioned to a no glow camera where we would have repeated images of the cat utilizing that same trail, which for us, over time, we had switched all of our cameras over to that technology So we weren't potentially training and educating or pushing animals to utilize new travel routes, limiting our ability to put a trap in place and remove them.
Thank you so much. We have another question. It's more about the ethic. So how to talk about the ethical question when you begin to start an eradication campaign?
So help me understand the question a little bit more.
Well, I don't really know how to say, how to talk about the ethical question when we talk about eradication of cats.
Yeah, no, that's okay. I understand. So for us, the ethics are around, in this case, we were originally anticipating on lethal removal. We don't prefer to have any animal harmed, whether it's a target or a non-target individual. But in many cases, it's far too expensive or just impossible to remove and to translocate an invasive species. In this case, which was the feral cats. And so the ethical conversation on our end is, well, if we are using lethal removal, how long is that going to take? And can we minimize how many animals are killed throughout that process? So once you're complete with an eradication, there is no need for lethal removal or harming any animals any longer. And we compare that ethical argument against the impacts to native species that's just ongoing, whether it's seabird kill, whether it's impacts to native foxes in this case. And we look at that in comparison to control, where if you're using lethal removal, that control is indefinite, right? You're making a decision to kill animals forever. And unless you have an alternative means, whether that might be even it's trap, neuter, and release, or if it's translocation, but you're taking that predator and you're putting it in a new environment. And in the case of San Nicolas Island, they were homed in a sanctuary where they weren't going to be released and having impacts on native wildlife any longer. So we found that happy medium. But oftentimes when we're looking at the ethics of control or eradication or even the lethal removal of animals, we think, how can we minimize that to the lowest point possible while still keeping in mind that ethical considerations for native species that may not exist anywhere else, where a feral or introduced species can be quite prevalent elsewhere.
Merci beaucoup, Chad, sur retour d'expérience et cette intéressante approche sur les problématiques éthiques qui est aussi très importante dans pas mal de questions qu'on a reçues aujourd'hui.
Fabrice.
Pardon, oui, on retrouve le contact de Chad en bas de ce slide. Et donc, pour ceux qui veulent le contacter, merci encore, Chad, de cette présentation. Nous allons retrouver Biz, qui va nous conclure cet épisode définitif, dernier. Nous sommes allés jusqu'à l'éradication des chats. Biz, please. Now it's your turn to conclude.
Thank you. Well, thanks to Chad and Lucinda for their really interesting talks and sharing their experiences of the cat eradications on their islands. And it's just shown how important it is to assess your island to select the right eradication option or combination of tools, but also taking into account all the legal, ethical, ecological and social aspects that may be part of your island. And it outlines also that importance of consultation, you know, especially with communities if present, but also with overall stakeholders. And part of that process is educating everybody about the impacts of cats and making sure you develop a really open and transparent relationship with everybody understanding and using the same messaging about the project. What's been also great is it shows the importance of that baseline monitoring of feral cats, but also of your key native species or any other invasive species that may be present on your island, to assess things like mesopredator release, and just being able to understand the behaviour and home range of the cats on the island, so how that can impact on your eradication processing and the protocols going forward. The key thing is these eradication projects require long-term commitments, capacity-wise, financially-wise, time, but also just shared information, not only for the eradication itself, but also for that important baseline monitoring, but also for the confirmation of the eradication at the end, and then that ongoing monitoring afterwards. And the eradications themselves, as we've found out, are really important to be able to restore these islands, and basically to protect native vulnerable species. So it's really important to continue to monitor those key species after eradications just to prove that these eradications are worthwhile, and that the recovery is super important. And the other thing which is fantastic about these workshops is sharing the knowledge and sharing those lessons learned from these other cat eradications that have occurred that can help cat eradication planning or control programs planning into the future. So I'd really like to thank the ICO team here for this amazing series of workshops, which is just, I think, have been incredibly valuable and been able to help share the message about cat eradications and all the options that are out there for us all.
Merci beaucoup. J'étais en train de faire le bilan de ces 3 épisodes que vous pouvez retrouver sur le site de ICO Solutions et dans les différents workshops. Les 2 premiers épisodes et celui-là vont se retrouver là. Je tenais vraiment à remercier toute l'équipe de ICO Solutions et du Conservatoire du littoral qui a travaillé pour la préparation de cette série, Enora, Cyrielle, Angélique, Céline. Je tiens aussi à remercier Isabella pour sa traduction. Merci avant tout à Elisabeth qui a fait les 3 épisodes à l'aube depuis le nord de l'île du Sud de Nouvelle-Zélande. Merci à Elsa qui était là dans les 2 premiers épisodes, à Vicente que nous avons eu la dernière fois, à Chad et aussi évidemment à Luciana qui était aujourd'hui, qui a témoigné. Merci à tous, merci à tous les participants d'avoir contribué à éclairer le public sur cette problématique, et merci à tous et bon courage pour la suite de vos opérations de gestion des chats et des gestions des espèces exotiques envahissantes sur les îles et les petites îles du monde. Merci à toutes et à tous, à très bientôt, bye bye.